Hey guys, this is Miss Arlequin, and in this lesson, I'm going to be introducing you to the scrambled paragraph section of the Specialized High School admissions test. So scrambled paragraphs are basically exactly what they sound like. They're paragraphs that are scrambled. They've been broken apart into separate sentences, and then the sentences are arranged into a different order. And then it's your job to basically put them back into their correct logical order so that the paragraph makes sense and has a logical flow. All right, so why are these questions so hard? Well, it's basically because so many of the sentences, when you look at them, seem like they could work in more than just one order. It's not always obvious what should be the second sentence or the third sentence or the fourth sentence. Sometimes the third sentence looks like it could be the second. So in order to understand how to solve scrambled paragraphs, the first thing you really want to have a good grasp on is how coherent paragraphs are formed. All right, so a paragraph, you should know, basically, are sentences arranged in an organized and coherent manner, and they're all related to a single topic, every sentence. Now, every single writing should be organized into paragraphs. Now, paragraphs, for the reader's purpose, really show the subdivisions of your writing. It helps the reader grasp the organization of your points and what your main points really are, your central ideas. Now, the first part of any paragraph is usually going to be the topic sentence. In most writing, the topic sentence is going to be the first sentence, but no matter where the topic sentence is located, the topic sentence's purpose is always the same. A topic sentence really introduces the central idea of the paragraph, and it's usually the most general sentence within the paragraph. So on the scrambled paragraph portion of the test, the topic sentence is the first sentence, although in other types of writing, topic sentences can be in other parts of the paragraph. Now, a well-organized paragraph is going to, again, develop a single controlling idea, and the topic sentence is really going to introduce it. Topic sentence has a couple of important functions. It's going to substantiate or support your writing, whether it's an essay or any kind of informational piece. It's going to substantiate and support that thesis statement or that controlling idea. It's going to unify the paragraph, and it's going to direct the order of the sentences, and it lets the reader know what the subject of that paragraph is. Now, another important idea within paragraphs is the idea of coherence. For a paragraph to be coherent, every sentence has to clearly relate to the topic sentence or the controlling idea. Meaning, if there's a sentence within the paragraph that has nothing to do with the other sentences, it doesn't belong there. Having a sentence like that within the paragraph makes an incoherent paragraph. If a paragraph is coherent, that means each sentence is going to flow smoothly into the next one without any obvious shifts or jumps. And so part of what you need to create coherence is keywords or transition sentences that link one sentence to the next one. All right, so we create coherence in a couple of ways. One way is by repeating keywords or phrases, creating parallel structures, being consistent in point of view, verb, tense, and number, and again using transition words or phrases between the sentences and in longer pieces between the paragraphs. So we know that transition words serve many purposes. You can have transition words that show location, that compare and contrast, that show time, that clarify, that add information. This is just a general idea of very common transition words. Transition words are very important when linking together your scrambled paragraphs, so you definitely want to pay attention to them. Those can be key into figuring out what sentence hooks up with another sentence. All right, so now I'm going to try it with a sample scrambled paragraph. This comes from the sample test from, I believe, 2007, 2008. The first thing you're going to want to do is you're just going to want to read all of the sentences just to get an idea of the gist. It's really the same thing you do when you read any text for the first time. What is this about? Chinese sailors used magnetic compasses long before Europeans did. Then, hanging in a windless place, the magnetized end of the needle would always point to the south. The magician would magnetize a needle and balance it on the rim of a cup to act as a compass. This balancing act was hard to maintain, and the needle often fell off. In fact, Some of the earliest compasses in recorded history were made by magicians in ancient China. A more effective way to keep the needle free to move in response to its magnetic pull was to attach a strand of silk to the center of the needle with a tiny piece of wax. Okay, so you might have noticed that as I was reading, I started to underline or highlight some transition words. That's really what my next step is going to be. I'm going to go back through the sentences and I'm going to look for not just transition words, but also phrases. I'm going to look for any phrase that when I read it, I can tell it's actually referring to an idea that has to have come from an earlier sentence. All right, so what do I mean by that? All right, let me switch to just a random sentence right here just to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. This magnetic force is extremely powerful. All right, when I read this sentence, I see that it begins with this pronoun, this. It's actually a pronoun phrase, this magnetic force. And the first thing that I think of as a reader is what magnetic force. I can tell from the general phrasing and the use of the pronoun this, that this sentence is talking about something that's already been defined, and it has to have been defined in an earlier sentence. I don't know what this magnetic force is, so there has to have been a previous sentence that talked about it. And if I can find that previous sentence that defines or first mentions the magnetic force, I know that that sentence must come before this one. All right, so now I'm going to go back to the paragraph, and again, I'm looking for the phrases that are kind of general, like this magnetic force. All right, so when I look at the topic sentence, I see that Chinese sailors used magnetic compasses long before Europeans did. So it's introducing the idea of Chinese sailors first, or being the first, to use magnetic compasses. All right, so then I go to the next sentence. Then hanging in a windless place. All right, so this is a sequence because I see the sequence word then. So something has to come before the compass or the needle is hanging in a windless place. All right, so this can't be the next sentence. It doesn't really follow from the topic sentence. All right, the magician would magnetize a needle. Okay, the magician. What magician? Because I've never, in the first sentence, seen that word magician. So again, this is kind of like this magnetic force. You can't just all of a sudden use a phrase like this without first introducing it in a previous sentence. So this can't be the next sentence. This balancing act. All right, what balancing act? I have to find a sentence that answers that question. What balancing act is hard to maintain? So this can't be the next one because there's nothing being balanced in the first sentence. In fact, some of the earliest compasses in recorded history were made by magicians. Okay. In ancient China. Right here, I'm seeing the connection between the magicians. This is the first place they're introducing the term magicians. They even have it in quotation marks because they're not really using it in the literal sense. They're not literally magicians. It's figurative language. And when I look, I can see that this is continuing the introduction or the idea that's introduced in that topic sentence. They're going a little bit more in detail about the Chinese sailors, and now they're calling them magicians. So I would say that this is the first sentence. Now, let me just look at the last sentence for any phrases. A more effective way to keep the needle free to move in response to its magnetic pull is to attach a strand of silk. Okay, to keep the needle free. Seems like this is part of that sequence that was kind of introduced with Q, so I'm going to hold off on that sentence. Now, when I first read sentence T, I linked it up with sentence R. So this would make logical sense that T would come first and R would come next. So let me read it together. That's another thing that I do. When I get sentences that look like they're hooked up together, I read them as a pair to see if it actually does flow well. Chinese sailors used magnetic compasses long before the Europeans did. In fact, some of the earliest compasses in recorded history were made by magicians in ancient China. The magician would magnetize a needle and balance it on the rim of a cup to act as a compass. Totally makes sense. It was total flow. I didn't notice there weren't any questions in my mind. I didn't notice any gaps of information. Okay. So what's happening in sentence R? Because I need to find some kind of key phrase that I can link up with the next sentence. It's talking about the needle being balanced. All right, so where else do I see needles being balanced? Right here, the balancing act. So it looks like this might be the phrases that key together and hook up these two sentences. The magician would magnetize a needle and balance it on the rim of a cup to act as a compass. This balancing act. Yeah, it works really well. So I think it's TRS. All right, so the balancing act was hard to maintain. The needle would often fall off. All right, so now after the needle would fall off, what would happen next? The end of the needle would always point to the south. This seems to work because I have the term then. They are describing a sequence of events that the magicians would do. So I'm going to say that this balancing act was hard to maintain. The needle fell off. Then, hanging in a windless place, the magnetized end of the needle would always point to the south. I think this is 4. And does the next sentence, the last one, flow? Does U logically come after Q? It would always point to the south. A more effective way to keep the needle free to move in response to its magnetic pull was to attach a strand of silk to the center of the needle with a tiny piece of wax. Yes. This seems to be the best logical relationship of sentences. Although, when I think about it, let me read it as a whole paragraph to really see if this makes sense. Chinese sailors used magnetic compasses long before Europeans did. In fact, some of the earliest compasses in recorded history were made by magicians in ancient China. The magician would magnetize a needle and balance it on the rim of a cup to act as a compass. This balancing act was hard to maintain and the needle often fell off. Then, hanging in a windless place, the magnetized end of the needle would always point to the south. Okay, now that I'm reading it as a whole paragraph, I realize my error. When I read sentence 4, coming after what I said was sentence 3, in sentence 3 the needle has fallen off, and yet the sentence I'm saying is sentence 4, the needle is not falling off, it's hanging. So that doesn't really make sense. That can't possibly be the next sentence. So I probably made an error in sentence 4 and 5. So let me try it the other way. Let me try making sentence U the 4th sentence, and then sentence Q the 5th sentence, and see if that actually makes sense. This balancing act was hard to maintain and the needle often fell off. A more effective way, okay, here we go. If the needle fell off, that was ineffective. So now they're introducing what they would do instead. A more effective way to keep the needle free to move in response to its magnetic pull was to attach a strand of silk, now it's not going to fall, to the center of the needle with a tiny piece of wax. Then, hanging in a windless place, the magnetized end of the needle would always point to the south. And that is my logical paragraph. So what I did here is I wanted to show you guys how if you don't read through the paragraph as a whole, when you think you have it in order, you can very easily make a mistake, like I was almost making a mistake. I went too quickly at the end, and I looked just at the transition words, and I wasn't looking at the paragraph as a whole and really thinking. So one of my most important tips for you is to always make sure that you read the entire paragraph through to check for careless, rushed errors.